Hi, I'm Libby Cornish from Decadent Alternatives. Welcome to the 6th video in my online gluten-free baking classes. In this video, I'd like to discuss starches and how they can help in gluten-free baking. Basically, I'll focus on the starches that are readily available, like, for example, maize starch or corn from corn flour, potato flour, tapioca starch, and arrowroot starch. When we're talking about starches, there are 5 important things that I'd like you to remember. 1, starch is a complex carbohydrate. It's more complex than sugar, and it is used as an energy source in plants. 2, wheat flour is more than 70% starch. 3, all starches on the market should have a protein content less than 1%. So they should be 99% starch. 4, all starches, or most of the starches, are different in structure. And 5, because of 4, they cannot, they're not necessarily going to be able to be substituted for one another in different recipes. So if we get back to 1, starches, are often given a bad rap because they're carbohydrate. But I really don't think they should. For great baking, you do need a good ratio of starch to protein in a thing. Sometimes when I'm in a supermarket, I'll pick up a gluten-free flour blend that might have on the packet no added starches. Unfortunately, if I turn over the back of the packet and read the ingredient list or the nutritional panel, it might have cassava flour, which is 93% starch, green banana flour, which is more than 75% starch, and brown rice flour, which is also about 75% starch. So although there is no added starch, they still do have starch in them. Coming back to starches on the market being 99% starch, a lot of them are actually labelled as flour. And this might be because it's seen to be better for companies to actually sell the starch as a flour. For example, you might have corn flour from corn, which is maize starch, and you'll also have corn flour from wheat, which is actually wheat starch. Potato flour, and here we have a little potato flour. If we turn around and have a look at the protein content, it is actually less than 1 gram. So it is actually, this is starch. And I have seen tapioca flour branded, which was, I think, 5 times the price of tapioca starch. Now, starches do differ in their structure. I don't want to get bogged down in the science side of things because it is really complicated. But the structure of a starch, it will affect how quickly, say, a sauce or a dough will thicken, at what temperature that will thicken, at what temperature it will set, and basically the rigidity of the starch when it is actually set. Now, there are huge implications for baking. In particular, just thinking of bread and the structure, the final structure. You can't cut into a loaf of hot bread until the starch is actually set. And so that will affect, or you'll want to know a specific starch that you actually use in a particular recipe. So what starches are readily available? Well, we have maize starch, potato starch, tapioca starch. There's a couple of different brands. This is one of the brands that you can get at Coles. And arrowroot. Now, most of the starch that is most of the arrowroot starch that is available in Australia is actually tapioca starch. So if we just focus on maize, potato, and tapioca. The starch that I found to be most similar to wheat starch is basically maize starch. It's a fairly drying starch, and it is actually quite rigid when it is set. So I add maize starch to a recipe. For example, if the wheat-based recipe uses pastry flour or cake flour, and that means that it's actually got more starch in that flour and the protein has dropped down a bit. So I'll add maize starch in there. I'll also add it in if I want to eat bread that is designed to be eaten straight out of the oven. And that might be, for example, hot cross buns or pizzas. Who wants to eat cold pizza? And that's basically because the maize starch sets at a higher temperature, and you can take it out and cut into it a lot sooner. The other recipe that I'll use maize starch for is if I have a wet ingredient in the recipe, or wetter than most. So for example, in my scones, I have a roasted pumpkin scone recipe. I'll add in maize starch to that just to give a bit more structure to the end product. For maize starch, or not for maize starch, for potato starch, it tends to actually be softer and not as rigid as maize starch in final products. So I'll use that if I want to make, say for example, if I want to make a cake slightly softer. So my vanilla butter cake recipe uses potato starch in there. I also use potato starch in my scones to give them a softer, to be softer in the end. Now, tapioca starch is what I consider to be the starch that has less structure in baked goods, in the end product, and it also seems to be a lot wetter. I will only use tapioca starch if I have a really, really dry ingredient like coconut flour. And in that case, I'll actually put it in. So if you wonder why I actually put maize starch in a particular recipe, there's some of the reasons. But thank you for listening. Okay, bye.